Well, it's good to see you all here tonight. It's been a great day here, spending time with you folks, and I'm really excited about what I'm going to be talking about tonight. So, say you had a hard day at work or at school, and you come home, and you kind of look through the mail, and there's an official-looking letter, and you pull it out, and it's from the tax service. And it informs you that they've taken a hard look at your tax return and they've found some irregularities and your taxes are being audited. Now the day's really going downhill. Maybe it passes through your mind, does anybody ever audit the tax service? Well, it just so happens that there's a friend of mine in our church, and that's his job. He works for the government, for a separate agency, and they audit the tax service. When I found that out, I said, whoa, that's cool. About time somebody did that. Because I want to know if that tax service is doing everything that they ought to do. I want to know if they're treating me fairly. Now, when it comes down to it, I wonder if sometimes we don't think that way about God. Maybe we wonder, does anybody keep an eye on God? I mean, it doesn't sound right to say it. God shouldn't need keeping an eye on. But isn't it true that sometimes in our lives, we wonder, what in the world is he doing? When things go really bad, we can't help but think, is somebody watching over this system? Because I can't figure out what God is doing. And I wish someone would ask him some serious questions. Well, actually, that's what happens in the book of Job. That's how the book of Job sets up. And so tonight we want to take a really quick run through the entire book of Job to try to get the bigger message of what's going on. And I hope the PowerPoint presentation is loaded and we can move into that as we move through some of this material. I've entitled this sermon, Wrecked. How to think about God when life goes wrong, when life falls apart, when you feel like you've been in a car wreck or a train wreck, your life feels like a train wreck. How should we think about God? And that's what the book of Job is meant to help us do. So I want to start out with 6 keys to understanding the book of Job. So the first one is, you can see them there. The first one is, Job has trials, but he's not on trial. Now, Job thinks he's on trial. He thinks he's sort of a defendant in a criminal case. And his friends think he's on trial. But the book makes it very clear that Job himself is not on trial because it exonerates him the very first 2 verses. And all through, nobody's really in doubt that Job has done nothing wrong that anybody can figure out. So Job has trials. But this book is not about Job being on trial. The second point, this book is more about God than it is about Job. Job is just the test case. It's a book about God. I know we call it the book of Job, but that's because we can't call every book in the Bible God. Okay? I mean, to be fair, it should be, because they're really all about God, not about Samuel or Kings or whatever. They're really about God. So, truth be told, it should be called God, but it's not. It's called Job because Job is kind of the main actor in the book. But so it's more about God than about Job. Now, what that means is that we're going to learn our lessons from God, not from Job. Job isn't here to tell us that we should act like he did. Job made lots of mistakes. He did stuff wrong. He responded inappropriately, and God calls him on it. If you read carefully in chapter 40, you'll see that. God calls him on it. There's kind of a "how dare you, Job" kind of moment. And so we're not reading the book to try to respond the way that Job does. He's one of many people in the book who's wrong. This is about God, and it's trying to help us know how to think about God when we go through things like Job went through. Third, it's more about God's wisdom than it is about his justice. Lots of times when we read the book, we think, well, this is exploring whether God is being fair, whether God is doing justice. And in the end, the book is going to somehow help us to understand how God is doing justice. It's going to defend God's fairness. No, it doesn't. And you know this if you read the book, because you get to the end and you say, wait a minute, there must be another chat. Wait, where's the rest of the book? Hey, how come it stopped here? Because you finish the book and it doesn't seem like it's answered the question that you thought you were going to get. And so it's not trying to defend God's justice. When God finally speaks at the end, and we have to assume that's where the answer to the book is, when God speaks, you're getting what the book has to offer. And when God speaks, he does not defend his justice. He doesn't say, okay, I've been busted, here it is, this is why people suffer. Nope. If you're reading the book to find out why people suffer, you might as well just stop right now and find another book, because that book does not tell you that. In the end, God does not defend his justice. He does not give reasons for suffering. In the end, God defends his wisdom. Wisdom of God says, trust me. Now we have to recognize that trust is something that comes into play when we don't have answers. If you had the answers to everything, you wouldn't have to trust anybody. Trust steps in where knowledge fails. And if we're supposed to trust God in difficult times, that implies that that's because we don't know why. We're going to talk about that a lot more. Number 4, it's not how to think about suffering, but how to think about God when you are suffering. There's very little theology of suffering. We can talk about it, but that's not really what the book is doing. Again, it's not trying to explain our suffering. Instead, how should we think about God when we're suffering? All of these are just setting the table for what we're going to do kind of throughout the evening. Okay? Number 5, touched on this one already. It's more about trusting than about answers. If you're reading the book to try to find out answers, again, this is not going to get you there. At the end, it's going to tell you, you ought to be trusting God even when you don't have answers. Again, we're just setting the table. And number 6, it's more about what constitutes righteousness than about why we suffer. Remember why Job is suffering. He's suffering because the question was posed to God, does Job serve God for nothing? That challenge did not suggest that Job does not serve God. Instead, the challenge says, okay, fine, he serves God. Why does he serve God? If you paid everybody off the way you've paid Job off, they'd all serve you. Anybody will serve God if it's working to their own benefit. And what you've done, God, is that you've created a mercenary out of Job. You pay him enough and he does what you ask. Call that righteousness? Call it bribery. Who wouldn't serve God if the payoff was that good? Does Job serve God for nothing. And you can't tell that unless you take it all away. Otherwise, how would you know? How would you know his motives unless you take away what may be the main motive? Take away his prosperity. Take away everything. Then you'll know if Job will still serve God. So the suffering is not the main point of the book. The main point of the book is Job's righteousness. What is the metal? What is the quality of his righteousness? Will he just drop it when he's not getting paid so well? Will he just desert God when there's nothing in it for him? The book is asking, what is the status? What is the quality of his righteousness? And I'm going to come back to suggest that that's really the main question on the table for all of us. Do we serve God for nothing? And again, the crucible, the test of that is, what do you do when life goes terribly wrong? How do you respond? That's the test in the book of Job. So let's move to the next slide and see what we've got. Slides. We have slides. Oh, slides. There we are. Okay, going to go through this one real quick. Job has a very careful structure. It's a very carefully crafted literary piece. And you can see that there's the prologue and epilogue. There are prose, and that's joined by the hymn to wisdom in the middle. We've got the 3 dialogue cycles in the first part, which is what we usually think of with Job, his friends talking back and forth to him. We've got the discourse cycles, Job's speeches, Elihu's speeches, God's speeches. And so the book is very carefully structured to carry out its job. Now, when we think about the strategy and message of the book, the first question is our indictment. Who is on trial? It's not Job. We've already talked about that. Job has trials. He's not on trial. Who's on trial? It's God's policies that are on trial. Not God himself. God's policies. And it's that policy of bringing prosperity to the righteous and punishment to the wicked. The righteous will prosper, the wicked will suffer. That's called the retribution principle. Retribution principle. Righteous will prosper, wicked will suffer. And that's how most people in the ancient world believed that God ran the world. We find it affirmed in certain portions of Scripture. And that's how people thought. That's how God kind of ran the world. And sometimes a lot of Christians today think the same thing. Sometimes we wouldn't frame it so succinctly and say, yeah, that's it. But we kind of think that's how it ought to work. So this idea of who's on trial, it's not Job, it's God's policies. Now, there's a 2-pronged accusation that's working out here. The first one comes from the one I like to call the challenger. In your Bibles, he's called Satan. If it's translated as Satan as a personal name, I don't know how it is in the Indonesian Bibles, but in English, it's often treated as a personal name, capital S, Satan. That's not quite correct. The text identifies him as the Satan. And all that means is it's not a personal name. Satan is a Hebrew word. And it means an accuser, a challenger, an adversary. And so here we have a challenger, challenging God. I'm not inclined to think that it's actually the devil. The devil gets that name Satan later on, and that's not in the Old Testament. But that's another issue for another time. I can't go into that tonight. So we have a challenger, and so with your indulgence, I'll refer to him that way. So you have the challenger, and the challenger, we've already talked about what he has to say. Does Job serve God for nothing? This is an accusation against God's policies. He basically indicates that God's policies are not very, very good policies, because if you prosper righteous people, you'll basically teach them to want the prosperity instead of to value the righteousness. If you're always getting paid for it, well, then you'll stop thinking about being righteous, and you'll think about your benefits, what you gain. And so the challenger is making the point that that means that's really a bad policy. It's a bad policy, God, for you to bring prosperity to righteous people because actually you're subverting their righteousness. You're undermining it because you're giving them a very strong ulterior motive. Be righteous because you stand to gain. You get something out of it. It's an interesting point. It has some psychological value to it. You could see where that could be the case. You might even imagine that that would be a difficult situation for you. And so that's the one prong of the accusation. When Job begins suffering, we see the other prong come into play. Because Job's point is, God, I just want you to think about something in your policies here. I just want to suggest that it's not a good idea for righteous people to suffer. I mean, after all, we're the good guys. We're on your side. And you're this all-powerful, all-good God, and therefore you should treat us nicely because we're doing what we're supposed to do. It's really kind of bad policy if righteous people suffer. You see it? I mean, you can understand how he would think that way. It makes sense, doesn't it? But now we've got both of those 2 points, the 2 prongs. It's not good policy for righteous people to prosper. It's not good policy for righteous people to suffer. What's a God to do? What's the right way to run things? How do you explain what goes on in the world? And that's what frames the book of Job and how it's set up. That 2-pronged accusation against God's policies. And Job is going to be the test case. Now, I talk about a courtroom. The courtroom, Job believes that he is a defendant in a criminal trial. He assumes since he is suffering that he has been accused of some wrongdoing that has brought his suffering. And so he thinks of himself as a defendant in a criminal case. He doesn't like that. He doesn't think that's fair. So what he tries to do is tries to turn it around and make himself the plaintiff in a civil case. That is, he's got a complaint against God. He's bringing a civil case, and he wants God to come into court and answer the claims that God has treated him unfairly. So he's trying to turn the case around and make himself a plaintiff in a civil case. Both of those are wrong. Neither one of them are a proper assessment. What Job doesn't know, what none of the people in it know, but what we can see is that Job is the star witness in the case against God. And Job is the one who is going to be the test case by which God's policies are tested. Way to go, Armin. So let's take a look at the courtroom. The courtroom is a philosophical courtroom. If we can go back to the slides. Okay, let's take a look at it. All right. Now, I've defined the retribution principle for you. That's at the top left. The righteous will prosper, the wicked will suffer. If any of you were here this morning, you heard about the great symbiosis. The great symbiosis is the idea that people were made, this is not in Israel, but the other nations, the people were made to meet the needs of the gods, and so God met the needs of the people. Now, both of those ideas are in play here. Both of those are part of the way that the thinking is unfolding. So let's think about this in terms of a triangle. In the 3 angles of the triangle, you can see that we've got the retribution principle in one, Job's righteousness in another, and God's justice in the third. When Job is prospering, all of that looks great. Everything's good. Job's prospering, so his righteousness, great retribution principle. He's doing well. God's justice, okay, everything is great. But when Job starts suffering, now we've got a problem because something's got to go. One of those angles has to give because you can't hold all 3 of them when Job, a supposedly righteous guy, is suffering. So it's interesting to see where people decide to build their defense. When Job's friends talk to him, that's Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, they build their fort. That's why I pictured it that way. They build their fort in the retribution principle. They say, okay, this is where we camp. We know the retribution principle is true. Well, then they have to look out at the other two angles and say which one of those is going to give. Because if the retribution principle is true, either God's not just or Job's not righteous. Something's got to give here. What's it going to be? And the friends look out and they say, well, boy, we really think God is just, and so we're going to hold on to that, and that means, oh, sorry, Job, I know you're our pal and you're a good guy, and we don't know anything wrong with you, but, just face the facts. You must be doing something horrible for you to be treated this way. So, Job, let us help you through it. Come on, you can tell us. Tell us all about it. Yeah, okay? So that's what they give up. And Job, of course, is not happy with that. Job, we know where he builds his fort. He builds his fort in the corner of his own righteousness. This I know. I am righteous. I haven't done anything to deserve all of this. And so he builds his fort there, and he looks out at the other two corners. What's going to give? What's going to give? And we find that in his speeches, he turns over the retribution principle again and again and again. He tries to find a weakness in it, but he can't. And that puts him in a position that's very awkward, because the problem then has to be in the justice of God. And so we find that Job increasingly is calling God into court. Come, face me with your accusations. Tell me what's wrong. And accusing God of injustice, which he does blatantly. And God calls him on it later on. So Job builds his fort in his own corner, and that ends up having him question God. Elihu, who is the last speaker who comes in just before God, not counted among the three friends, he comes in and he builds his fort up there in God's justice. And we'd be inclined to say, well, that's a good place to build your fort in God's justice. But what's going to give now? Which one's he going to give up? The retribution principle or Job's righteousness? Well, he cheats a little bit. He would call it being nuanced and subtle. But he cheats a little bit because he redefines the retribution principle. Instead of the retribution principle being that you've done things wrong in the past, and so now God is punishing you, it's rather when punishment comes, all of the things that you have wrong show up. So kind of the wrong things come after the suffering starts, instead of before the suffering that brings it on. And for Elihu, Job's crimes are not things in the past. Job's crime is that he is really one self-righteous dude. And that shows the weakness in his character. That's the flaw. And the suffering draws that out, so we find out what a self-righteous dude he is. Okay? So in that way, he's able to identify, here's the problem with Job. It's not a problem in the past, like the friends thought. It's a problem right now. Okay, so that's the triangle of claims that we find set up in the book of Job. And lots of the book is kind of working out the details of that triangle. So, from there, where do we go? Let's ask the question, okay, so the courtroom retribution principle, the triangle, the trial. So how could God lose? God could lose to the challenger's accusation. God could lose if Job listens to his wife. She says, curse God and die. In other words, exactly what the challenger said would happen. You'll just throw it away and forget all about God, and you might as well just curse God and die. That way, the challenger would be right. Job really wasn't interested in righteousness. He gave it away the minute the opportunity came. And God would also lose if Job listens to his friends. Job's friends were saying, look, Job, forget about all this I'm righteous stuff, okay? You've lost a lot, and you want to get it back. Am I right, buddy? Am I right? You want to get it back. You know, you don't want to be kind of at the bottom of the food chain here and the bottom of the pile and lost everything and suffering. You want to get it back, let us help you. We're going to help you figure out how to get it back. All you have to do is do whatever it takes to get God's favor back. Now, this is that great symbiosis thing. You take care of the gods will take care of you. Obviously, God's upset about something. Who knows what? You know, and so you just need to do whatever it takes to appease him. So this is what I'm suggesting, Job. Just confess everything. Oh, yeah, I know you don't think you did anything. But look, this is what you do. Just say, yes, God, I did all those sins. I did them all. I'm guilty, and I'll do anything. Just do what it takes to get God's favor and get your stuff back. Now, if Job does that, he is basically admitting that righteousness doesn't matter. He's basically admitting that this is a payoff system. He's basically admitting that he's been nothing but a mercenary. And he's admitting that the most important thing is your stuff, your benefits. And if he does that, God loses. Because that would mean that his righteousness really wasn't the main thing in the equation. See it? So, God could lose if he listens to his wife. God could lose if he listens to his friends. God could lose if God does what Job says. Job's trying to call him into a court to explain himself. I want you to give me a reason for this. I want you to justify what you have done. And if God does that, then Job would feel an air of superiority. And we find out that he would not be left with a God who is worthy of his worship. There's lots of ways God could lose. But God's defense is a defense that concerns his wisdom. Now, we'll get to that in a minute, but we'll just kind of keep it up there. We find that Job makes his final stand against the friends in chapter 27. It's his last speech in the discourse section. And there in verse 2, he says, "As surely as God lives, who has denied me justice." See that accusation against God? He's denied me justice. The Almighty who has made me taste bitterness of soul, as long as I have life within me, the breath of God in my nostrils, my lips will not speak wickedness. What wickedness is he talking about? My tongue will not utter deceit. What deceit? God's speech is still a couple minutes off. Okay. I will never admit that you, his friends, are in the right. That is, he's not going to listen to his friends. He's not going to follow their advice. Instead, till I die, I will not deny my integrity. What is his integrity? Next verse. I will maintain my righteousness and never let go of it, and my conscience will not reproach me as long as I live. At that point, the friends are done. At that point, the challenger is done. Job has made the point, I will not give up my righteousness. His fort is in that corner. He's not doing right in accusing God of injustice. But he's made a point that he is not going to give up his righteousness. For Job, it is not just about stuff. It's not just about the benefits. He's not a mercenary. He had a t-shirt, I am not a mercenary. No, he didn't. I made that up. Okay? But he's made that point. But we still have a bunch of the book to go. At that point is when chapter 28, the hymn of praise comes in. And the hymn of praise, it's the narrator saying, okay, we've now listened to the wisest people in the world give their assessment of Job's situation. We've heard everything. We've heard the best they have to offer. And what have we got? And nothing. You call that wisdom? You got nothing. Now it's time to get to wisdom. And so with a deft swipe, it wipes away all of that wisdom that was being offered by Job as well as his friends to say we really have to think about this more clearly. And so it moves into the second part of the book. Well, we have to move quickly because time, alas, goes on. So let me talk about some of the basic things that I would say in the end are the teachings of the book of Job. What does it have for us? Okay? The first thing that God establishes in his speech when he finally speaks in chapter 38 and following, is that the world around us is not fully endowed with God's attributes. That is, just because the world is not just doesn't mean that God is not just. God does not impose his justice on the world at every moment, in every person's life, in every situation. If he did, if justice were all that existed, if God's justice permeated the world, it would be an empty world. None of us could stand up to that. None of us would be here. It would be a great, big, just, empty world. So, God does not work that way. Okay? The regular operations of the world do not reflect the nature, character, attributes of God. So when you see how the world is working around you, you can't say that's God working. Certainly God can insert himself, do something different than you would expect at any time, but the world does not reflect God's attributes at every point. That's not because God is incapable or because God doesn't care. It's rather the way that he has chosen to do it. We'll move on to the next one. If we really believe that God is wise, and we are not, then we can turn over control to him in spite of our lack of understanding. See, that's the idea of trust. We are not in charge. God is wise, and we can turn over control to him. Lots of times when we see things go horribly wrong around us, or even in our own lives, in the lives of loved ones, or even in the difficult parts of the world, we're inclined to say, what is God doing? Can't he do a better job than this? I mean, look at the poverty, look at the refugees, look at the destruction, look at the war, look at the tyranny, look at this, look at that, look at this, look at that. Can't God do a better job than this? And sometimes we get to thinking that we could out-God God. That somehow we could do it better. And that's always a big mistake. We shouldn't think that we can do it better than God. The retribution principle is not the foundation of how the world works. Let's turn our attention back to a familiar passage. It's in John 9. And it's where Jesus and the disciples encounter the man born blind. And remember, the disciples ask a very poignant question. See, they're walking around with Jesus. And, talk about a great opportunity to get your questions answered, So they pass this man born blind, and the retribution principle just pops into their heads. This is a chance to find out this whole thing about the righteous prospering and the wicked suffering and how God works in all of this. We've got Jesus right here. And so they ask the question, tried to be nonchalant. So, Jesus, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he's born blind? Okay, we're going to get it now. This is the philosophical question of the ages. And Jesus is here on a Q&A. Yes! Who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus says, no. It was neither this man nor his parents. And, the disciples are saying, oh, yeah, we forgot. This is what Jesus always does. And we never get a straight answer from Jesus. It was neither this man nor his parents, but that the Son of Man might be glorified. Well, what's that mean? What am I supposed to do with that? I mean, is he suggesting that kind of in eternity past, there was a Trinity committee, and God the Father and God the Son and God the Holy Spirit got together and they said, there's going to come a day when they walk by this man born blind. Let's make this man born blind so Jesus can heal him. No, of course not. Because Jesus is not giving a reason. Jesus is giving a purpose. And there's a difference between a reason and a purpose. When we look to the past, we are seeking causes. We are thinking reasons. We want explanations. Tell me why this happened. Why is the man born blind? Tell me why it happened. And we do it all the time, don't we? I mean, there's the big question. Why? Why, God? Why me? Why now? Why this? Why? It's a question we always ask when things go wrong. And God doesn't answer those questions. Some people think there's going to be some kind of booth up in heaven that's called the why booth, and they'll get to line up at it and ask their questions, and they'll get all their answers. I don't think so. I don't think that's going to happen because that's assuming that there are explanations. And I'm not convinced there are. Some things happen to us because the world is as the world is. God, in his wisdom, created the world as it is. And as the world is, sometimes things happen. And it's not like God made that happen or this happen with a reason. It happens because the world is the way that it is. So I'm not sure we should even think there always are reasons. But we can think that there always are purposes. And that doesn't always mean that we'll see what the purposes are. But you see what Jesus is asking his disciples to do? They've asked their why question. Why is this man born blind? So they're doing this, looking to the past, trying to sort this out. It can't be the man himself because he was born this way. And it can't be the parents because then why is the man suffering? And none of that makes sense. So tell us why. They're looking to the past and they're asking, tell me the why. Jesus says, turn around 180. Don't look to the past. Look to the future. What for? What for? What is the purpose that can be brought out of this? Don't ask how I got into this mess. Ask, what do I do now that I'm in it? How can I serve God in this miserable situation that I'm in? Not, why did God do it to me? What can God do through me? How can this serve God? And so we find that the book has a lot to offer us about how to think about God when we're suffering. Not to demand the why, but to think about what is the nature of our righteousness. So, summary of the answers we've talked about. Number one, don't think there is an explanation. Number two, we cannot out-God God. Number three, we grow in grace by trusting. That's the growth that can happen. An exercise in trusting God. If there's never anything that's uncertain in our lives, we don't have to trust God. We grow in grace when we trust God. Number four, God's wisdom prevails. We cannot assess his justice. We don't have enough information. We don't see it through his eyes. We don't know the broader purposes. We cannot assess the issue of justice. And we can't always ask it in terms of the retribution principle. I don't deserve this. That's not the issue. Everything is not determined by what someone deserves. The retribution principle does not work that way. And so, it's God's wisdom that prevails. There's a book written a couple decades ago. It was self-published when it was written, but it became extremely popular and in a sense went viral, and then finally was picked up with a publisher, and maybe you've heard of it. It's called The Shack. Anybody heard of that one, The Shack? It's a work of fiction, but it talks about a man who's suffering greatly, and he sort of has encounters with the various persons of the Trinity talking about his situation. And right toward the end, spoiler alert, right toward the end, okay, read it anyway. There's this conversation that he has with the character who is representing God. And God says, Mackenzie's his name. Mackenzie, if you loved me, you would trust me. And better yet, if you knew that I loved you, you would trust me. But you don't. And if you don't love and don't know you're loved, you can't trust. Now, the book was controversial, and there's a lot of things you could kind of get into discussion about, but that's a very powerful point. The importance of trusting God. So, last one on the list there, the challenge to us. Will our righteousness withstand crises? Would we serve God without reward? Really, that's the same kind of question that Abraham faced when God said, go sacrifice your son. It was a question of, if you have to give up everything, there's nothing left in it for you. Because that wasn't just his son, that was the covenant. If Isaac's gone, the covenant's gone. Would you give up every benefit you have in this relationship with me and still serve me? And that's what Job was about. Even when you lose it all, would you still serve me? And that's the question to us. Even if there were no benefits to be had, what if there were no salvation? What if there were no heaven? What if there were no eternal life? What if there were no forgiveness? Would we serve God anyway? Is our righteousness up to that our focus is on God and God alone? And that it's really not about what we get out of it? That's a tough challenge. Of course, we'll never have to decide between those two. Those things can't be taken away from us. But how are we doing? How's our righteousness stand up? So we might ask, where exactly does God put himself on this triangle of claims? How does God position himself? What's the answer that the book has in regard to this? Well, God, he replaces it with another triangle. It's no longer a triangle of claims. It's a triangle of trust. You're not trying to figure it out. We can't spend our life trying to figure out what God is doing and why. It's a wasted life. We don't get the answers to why. But no matter what happens, God wants us to trust him, to trust his wisdom, to trust his love, to trust that the world is the way it is because that's the way it should be. And we lean on him. The discussion about the two chaos creatures in God's second speech confuses us all, but that's really where the point is made. The first one is some kind of great beast in the reeds and the waters, and the point that it makes is that that beast stands firm and secure in the raging waters. So should you. We sometimes stand in raging waters and we risk getting swept away. Stand firm and secure in the raging waters, not hoping they'll go away, in the raging waters stands firm. And the second one, Leviathan, the point he makes is, when you look at Leviathan, this big dragon, breathing fire, 7 heads, you look at Leviathan and you don't think for a minute that you could domesticate him, make him a pet, calm him down, tame him. Not for a moment would you think that. So don't think that of God. Don't think you can domesticate God. You cannot tame God to your frame of thinking. See, that was the problem with Job and his friends. They thought God's actions in the world could be reduced to a silly little triangle. And God says, how ignorant to think that you can reduce God's working in the world by your little equations. It's not how God is. Don't think you can domesticate God. You can't get God in your pocket. You can't manipulate God. You can't turn him to your ends and agendas. You can't argue with him. You can't accuse him. You trust him. Now, in Paul's benediction at the end of Romans, it almost seems like he's talking about the book of Job. Romans 11, 33 and 35, we close with this. Oh, the depth of the riches of the wisdom and knowledge of God. That makes sense now, right? Focuses on God's wisdom and knowledge, the depth, the riches. How unsearchable his judgments. Now it's talking about his justice. He doesn't give account of himself. His justice cannot be measured or assessed. How unsearchable his judgments and his paths beyond tracing out. You can't just say he's going to work in this triangle, retribution principle, simple equation. No, God's paths are beyond searching out. Who has known the mind of the Lord? You can't tell how God thinks. You can't tell why he's doing what he's doing. Or who has been his counselor? Don't think you can dictate to God how he ought to work. Don't think you can tell God how to do his job, and certainly don't think that you can do it better. Who has been his counselor? Nobody. Who has ever given to God that God should repay them? And so Paul says, by the way, God owes you nothing. God owes you nothing. For from him, and through him, and for him are all things. To him be glory forever. Amen.